Hello, I've taken the feedback from the previous video, and the answer is yes, you guys love playing multiplayer. As of writing, it seems about 40% of you play multiplayer exclusively, and when we factor in the people that mentioned playing a mix of multiplayer and solo, that bumps up to nearly 60%, and then if we look at the 40% of people that prefer to hunt solo, it seems like only 16% of people want to hunt solo without followers. So it's high time we make a video about multiplayer and its effect on Lance. So here we are. Okay, the plan for this video is going to be a bit different from the other videos that I normally make about the Lance. I'd like to make this one more of an open discussion so that we can have a chat about the effects that multiplayer has on the Lance, because there's a lot of them and it sort of complicates things for like hyper specific set optimization. So let's work towards some shared assumptions that we can all have and what to expect in multiplayer. And once we've got that, we can then start thinking about sets and how to change sets for multiplayer further down the road. So as this is an open form, I'd really love to see your thoughts underneath this video, as it's going to help us get a wider scope of the topic. There might be stuff that I've missed out or had to cut for time that are actually really important if you think about it. And if you've got some that you think are important like that, then I'd love to see it down in the comment section. It's going to help everybody out. So to start this, let's look at the main things that change in multiplayer compared to solo hunts. So the main thing that changes in multiplayer is that you finally have the friends that you've always hoped and dreamed. Okay, joking aside, we have more people in the hunt, and that actually changes quite a lot about how you want to go about things. Firstly, the game is designed to attack all players more or less equally. So when you have more players, the attention, or the aggro, that the monster normally gives just to you in solo play will be split by all of the players. This is good because it means that you're gonna get hit less because you're gonna be targeted less, but it's also bad because the Lance has a bunch of get hit, or rather get countered, to get a buff. So having less aggro makes the DPS of certain skills decrease, and because of that, the value of those skills is going to change. And because most of those skills also end up being very raw focused, the way that we build and play Lance might be changing as well. For Guard Lance, the biggest things that get hit are quite obviously Offensive Guard and Anchor Rage. Combined, the skills have a ceiling of a 20 to 30% damage buff, depending on the Anchor Rage color that you have, which is a really sizable increase to your damage. But the less you activate them, the lower the damage buff is going to be, effectively. So the lower the aggro, the worse these skills get. Also, shout out to Adrenaline Rush for evade lancing, as it basically does the same thing, or rather has the same problem. And speaking of skills that are negatively affected, we should bring up Embolden. Embolden is an amazing skill. It's just guard, but better. Or at least that's how it is when you're playing solo, when the monster's aggro is overwhelmingly centered on you. But the thing that often goes unspoken is that Embolden only works when you're being targeted by the monster. So when the monster is targeting someone else and decides to use a huge area of effect explosion, or when they spit a fireball at its intended target that happened to decide to roll behind your back, Embolden will not help you when blocking the incoming damage. And that sort of creates a tricky conundrum for us in terms of what guard skill to bring, how much of it do we want, and do we want a balance, and when to choose one skill over the other in terms of monster matchups, as certain monsters are a lot more area of effect orientated. The short, unhelpful, and somewhat cheeky solution to this is just to not bring any and rely on insta-block and Anchor Rage to block the attacks. And if we consider the reduced aggro that you're getting, you do probably want to convert as many attacks into damage buff as possible. So all things considered, it's not bad advice, but it's not good advice either, as you're basically out there without a safety net. And some of the later game monsters are hitting really, really hard, even through shield. Moving on to some positive stuff, because multiplayer does actually positively benefit certain things as well. The decreased aggro means that big commitment attacks are easier to pull off, and obviously that means more opportunities to use them, which means more damage. Our biggest hitter here is Skyward Thrust. Skyward Thrust, by DPS alone, is the Lance's single biggest hitting attack, assuming of course that you can at least hit two of the ticks basically at the apex of the jump, which is something that can happen for a lot of monsters. And there are a few monsters where you can even hit 3, but normally you don't see Skyward Thrust used very often, even though it's such a great DPS move, because it's got a it's got a big commitment window, and there aren't very many times, or opportunities rather, when you can use the attack, land it, and also be confident that the monster won't then swing its tail to hit you. But once the monster's aggro is split between the party, your ability to use Skyward Thrust is greatly increased. So because of the decreased aggro, you've got more time to spam things, which means more damage. But as an example of how deep this rabbit hole can go, being able to spam Skyward Thrust more often is going to increase your rate of sharpness usage, which means you're going to need more sharpness protection, which means you have to tweak your set to get extra sharpness on, and that might mean less damage on the set, and then you have to compare spamming Skyward Thrust with not spamming Skyward Thrust, and it gets very complicated very quick. Getting back on track, you've got skills like Protective Polish and Grinder S that are also positively benefiting from the decreased aggro, and this also includes any other skill that needs you to sharpen or to charge up or whatever else that isn't directly attacking the monster at the second of using the skill, all become more useful as the decreased aggro lets you commit to the time needed to charge up or to sharpen, for the lack of better words, buff up, while not attacking the monster. However, one important thing to consider or to remember in regard to these skills is that they're only benefiting from being in multiplayer with the decreased aggro when you're using downtime that you couldn't otherwise be using to hit the monster to buff up. So if the monster charges off towards a heavy bow gunner on the other side of the area, and you use the opportunity to reapply Protective Polish or Grinder S, then you've made a great use of the diverted aggro, and you have positively benefited from being in multiplayer. But if the gunner is actually really close to you, and you could have hit the monster instead of sharpening, then the skill falls into the same issues that they normally do, i.e. being more of a DPS loss than an increase once you balance out the time that you're not attacking with the damage increase. And on that note, let's deal with another big aspect of monsters in multiplayer. Monsters love to run around a lot, or at least a lot more compared to solo. And this can be doubly exacerbated by having certain team members or weapon users in the party, and it can make closing the gap more of an issue than it is in solo play. And I guess this is important because it doesn't matter if you can do amazing DPS if you can't stay near the monster to deal that DPS. So I think the main things that you want to think about in this regard is that when a monster's turning around a lot, it makes weak points more difficult to access, and it also makes those weak points further away when the monster decides to chase after someone else in the team. And in return, that devalues skills that focus on weak points and increases the value of attacks that can get you to move from A to B. But quick disclaimer, when I talk about the skills that focus on weak points, the main one that we're probably all thinking of is Weakness Exploit, and I want to nip any potential confusion in the bud. Weakness Exploit is way too strong to drop, and while I want to bring up that weak points might not always be accessible, or they will at the very least become more difficult to hit when a monster turns around, it's still always worth having Weakness Exploit because you're going to be wanting to hit the best hit zones that you can, as they'll always deal more damage, and most of the time there will be a hit zone that procs Weakness Exploit on the back end of the monster, even if it's a worse hit zone than the weak point up front. And speaking of back ends of the monster, Sneak Attack is another skill for us to consider, but similarly to Weakness Exploit, I don't think the value changes that much. ultimately the best hit zones are, in almost all cases, at the front of the monster. So even in a perfect situation where the monster is always chasing someone else, allowing you to attack its tail or whatever weak point that it's got on its behind, in most situations, it's gonna be worse damage going for the tail with sneak attack than it would be just to attack the head. However, on the flip side, we should also consider that you're not always able to hit the head or hit the better half. So sneak attack improving the less valuable hit zones that you're sometimes forced to deal with will make your armor set more rounded in terms of its ability to deal DPS to the monster overall. Again, open discussion, food for thought. The third big part about monster wiggling that changes things up for Lance is the wiggling away from you bit. Firstly, that means a shout out to the base rise meta. Spiral Thrust comes back into the picture. Spiral Thrust has definitely fallen off given the Sunbreak balance patch, but doing damage is still better than not doing anything. And if you're finding it difficult to catch up to the monster in multiplayer, Spiral Thrust might just be the option for you. And in a similar manner, the Lance normally likes to use Shield Charge as a replacement for its dash attack, as it does nearly the same damage, while also giving you KO potential for an extra knockdown or two. However, if the monster is running around a lot, it might be more effective to use dash attack, as it can cover greater distance with less stamina cost, making it a more consistent gap closing option. I guess it's a question about whether or not you want the gap closing ability or the stun potential, or knockout potential rather. Speaking of KOing monsters, let's talk about the other thing about multiplayer hunts: teamwork. It's no hidden secret that Lance sort of lacks any big hitting moves that can capitalize on a CC'd monster. The weapon doesn't have one big hit that can benefit the wake up damage multiplier, and it doesn't have a lengthy but rewarding damage combo string that deals a truck ton of DPS to paralyzed monsters, not to mention that when your monster is crowd controlled, CC'd, your temporary damage buffs from Offensive Guard and Anchor Rage are running out, meaning that you're possibly doing less damage than you would be if the monster was actually fighting you back. But the key word there is you, because when you're in a group, we don't care about individual DPS, we care about team DPS. And I can guarantee that your 3 greatsword buddies will love it if you can KO the monster for them. Unfortunately, there is no way to math out how much extra DPS you'll be contributing to the fight by KOing or CCing a monster with the purpose of getting others to do extra damage. So I don't think we'll ever get to address the question, how often should you forsake your own DPS to increase the DPS of others? But it's worth thinking about still. On another level, if we can quietly increase the aggro that we get as a Lancer, we can in theory increase our damage potential from Offensive Guard and Anchor Rage, while also increasing the damage potential of our teammates that don't want the aggro, so that they can pull off more of their big fancy attack combos. And that's where the diversion skill comes in. And the short answer is yes, if you're using Anchor Rage or Offensive Guard in multiplayer, you also want to be using the diversion skill, as it increases the likelihood that monsters target you instead of someone else. And it's also a level 1 skill, so it's essentially free, even if it's not actually that much of an aggro increase, which it seems to be nebulous. It's free, you might as well. Nebulous is a great word. It seems to be a bit of a mystery, or at the very least very poorly explained and not very well signposted on the internet, how diversion actually works. I haven't been able to verify this, but it does seem to match up with my experience playing the game. So here's one possible way that has been put forward as to how it works. Firstly, monsters don't just choose who they attack randomly, but instead they do it based on a hidden threat mechanic. However, I've done a lot of digging and I've not found a specific stat in game, so it might be based on damage, it might be based on the attack part modifier of your attacks. I don't know, but but that's the suggestion. There is a hidden threat mechanic. In this scenario, the diversion skill artificially increases the threat damage that you do, and that makes it more likely that you get attacked. And subsequently, it also means that the aggro increase from diversion depends on how well you're attacking the monster, which might explain why diversion feels really, really iffy half of the time. So periodically, after a string of attacks or two, the monster will check the threat level and give the player with the bigger threat levels a higher chance of getting attacked. And then it will randomly choose a character to fight, and it'll attack them for a couple of attacks, or like a combo string, and then it'll repeat the process, check the threat level, and do it to a different character, possibly. Now, that does sound a little convoluted, and to my knowledge, before trying to figure out how it actually worked, I just assumed that monsters would randomly choose who to attack, and if you had the diversion skill, you would have a higher chance of being picked for the next attack. However, in personal experience, I do feel like there is at least something to do with attacking that draws aggro, but once again, we've got to take this with a huge margin of salt, or pinch of salt rather, because there's just not any concrete data that I can find. So getting back on topic, diversion's alright. If you want increased aggro for Anchorage or Offensive Guard, then you definitely want diversion, but it's difficult to say how much it actually helps by, especially if other people are also using diversion, which they might be, but it's still basically free. So unless you're completely dropping Offensive Guard and you're not using Anchorage, then you still want diversion. Another thing to think about in the broader sense of team dynamics is playing around each other effectively. Now, I'm not going to get all nostalgic about the beautiful Monster Hunter etiquette of old. It seems like the player base has gotten too big and grown past that stage of the Monster Hunter-ness. But playing the Lance well in multiplayer requires you to be good at hitting the monster, but also good at supporting your teammates. I previously mentioned that Spiral Thrust was a pretty good move for keeping up with a wiggly monster, but on the other hand, it's also a pretty good move to knock over your teammates. In a world where flinch-free exists, it's very easy for people to just assume that everyone wears flinch-free and that you can ignore how your actions interact with others. But I know that none of us Lance bros are that fickle. As we all know, even with flinch-free, there are many situations where players can interrupt each other. And the Lance is in an awkward spot because we have moves like Spiral Thrust that are highly spammable and, in theory, great for use in multiplayer. However, it's gonna knock other people on their ass, even if they're using flinch-free. So you've got to be mindful when using your attacks that you're not tripping up other people, even if they don't happen to have flinch-free or something. If we think about it in terms of just DPS, it gets a bit messy because in theory, if you're able to do more DPS by spiral thrusting than you would by having both you and your teammate attack, then technically it would be more optimal to just spiral thrust through your friend. But to nip that in the bud, your friend would have to be doing next to no damage, like new to the game, new to the series, using low rank weapons at G rank tier of no damage. And that sort of situation isn't really something that happens. And in reality, 2 people attacking the monster is always going to be better than 1 person attacking the monster, so don't trip people up. Because again, it's not about your DPS, it's about everyone's DPS. But even more importantly, in a hypothetical situation where you doing damage at the cost of other people is actually better DPS, you still shouldn't do it because you'll be an asshole. I talk a lot about optimizing things and trying to play the game more efficiently on this channel, and that's because I think it's fun to do that. I love pushing the boundaries of games like Monster Hunter, but there's always a limit, and trying to be efficient at the cost of other people's fun pushes past that limit, and that's not cool. Especially because I think Lance is uniquely indisposed at being one of the most trip-uppable weapons in the game. Although technically all predominantly shield weapons are on the losing end of the stick here. So here's a PSA for people that play with other people that use shield weapons. Flinch-free has no effect when they're guarding. If you're guarding something and you attack them, the game will see that attack just as if it was a monster attack. So if someone's counterattacking and you poke them, they will start counterattacking your poke, which means if they were counterattacking a big scary monster attack, they're already counterattacking and the monster's attack is gonna hit them. And that sucks. Should Flinch Free stop this? Probably, but unfortunately it doesn't. And so the big thing that we've all got to be aware of in multiplayer is don't use the existence of Flinch Free as an excuse to just ignore your teammates. Because playing the game solo and playing the game with other people are two completely different things. And playing a multiplayer hunt as if you're solo is just kind of inefficient. So, yeah. So, as I've said many times in this video, I want this to be more of a discussion creating food for thought video rather than anything overly prescriptive about what skills to use and what skills not to use in game. And hopefully we can inspire some discussion and get a bunch of really cool ideas going around and sort of just to think about how the lance changes when you're playing multiplayer. There's a huge number of factors to think about when dealing with multiplayer, and I feel like I'm only scratching the surface here. But I've also spent far too long scripting this, so we are going to have to leave it here. I hope it's given you a bit of insight into the options that Lance has for multiplayer, or at the very least given you a bit of an insight into how deep the rabbit hole can go when you start trying to analyze all of the factors that goes into making one set good or one set worse or whatever. So that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more. Please like the video. The more likes we get, the more the algorithm decides to spread the video, and that means more discussion and more useful info for everyone, really. And of course, finally, I want to thank you for watching. See you next time.